Hello and welcome to Lion and Mouse Commentary. We're your hosts, Tori.
And Holland.
Two best friends as different as a lion and a mouse. Today we're reviewing episodes 6 through 10 of Season 1 of Avatar: The Last Airbender, and we'll be ranking it on an objective scale of 0 to 10 with only 2 points allotted for personal taste. As always, feel free to agree, disagree, or learn about something new. And as always, tread lightly, spoilers ahead. Cut to the intro. Okay, welcome to the Lion's Den. Okay, so this is a continuation of a previous episode. We have already reviewed episodes 1 through 5 of the first season of Avatar: The Last Airbender. So if you haven't listened to that episode, you probably want to start there and then move here. As always, we break down the scoring system by category as we go, but remember you can check that on our website as well. So obviously this is familiar to both of us. To kind of refresh your memory if you're not familiar with the series. This is a series that was on Nickelodeon. It first aired in 2005, and then the series ended with a 2-hour television movie in 2008. We have many more facts on our previous episodes, so you're welcome to go back and listen to those. I also just want to give a quick recap of the last episode of the first time we talked about Avatar, which we left off on episode 5, which this is the summary from the Avatar: The Last Airbender wiki, that says, while in Omashu, Aang and the gang accidentally destroy parts of the city on a joyride on the city's mail system, and the king of Omashu challenges Aang to 3 tasks that require creative thinking before allowing Aang and his friends to leave the city. So that was where we stopped last time. So this time we're going to be picking up with episode 6. So for that, I guess, Holland, you can go ahead and kick us off.
All right. So our first category is plot, story, and cohesion. So total score of 2 for this category. And I actually gave this set of episodes total 1 out of 2 points. So the episodes, I have a list of the episodes that I wrote down. So episode 6 is Imprisoned. Episode 7 is The Spirit World, The Winter Solstice. Episode 8 is Avatar Roku, The Winter Solstice. Episode 9 is The Waterbending Scroll, and episode 10 is Jet. So overall, I think these episodes do a good job of cohesion. It kind of continues that road trip story that we started off in episode 4 and 5 in the last chunk of episodes that we reviewed. I think 6, 7, and 9 contribute pretty well to the overall series plot. For example, in episode 6, Zuko finds Katara's necklace. In episode 7, Aang is discovering Roku's location so we can figure out how to talk to him. Episode 8, pretty much all of that contributes to the plot pretty well. The whole part with the winter solstice. And episode 9, Aang gets a bison whistle, which kind of contributes to the plot, and then Zuko kind of catches up to him. So overall, it kind of continues to move the plot forward. Episode 6, I'm going to kind of go a few episodes at a time. Episode 6, I really like that it has this interesting concept that, no good deed goes unpunished, which is really not done very often in a kid's show. So, they help Haru helps this old man out, and then he turns out to just turn him into the Fire Nation, which I think is a really interesting concept, but I generally think the rest of the episode is kind of boring. You're dealing with this kind of prison escape plot-ish, Haru, and you learn about Katara's mom. Katara gets arrested. She kind of preaches about hope, and earthbenders shouldn't give up hope, and I mean, I just think it's kind of flimsy a little bit. One thing I do want to, in reviewing the show, this is still technically a kid's show, and I don't want to forget that aspect of the show and be overly harsh on it. But I think that in general, there's a lot of complexities and intricacies in this show as a whole, and I think that it merits a pretty critical review because, I mean, as we continue to review this series, And Tori and I are both very familiar with it. Personally, I think this series just gets better and better after season 1. And I think season 1 overall, in my perspective, kind of, no spoilers here, but season 1 overall feels the most like a kid's show. And I think that it just matures as the show goes on. So this is one of those episodes where it kind of feels like a kid's show. It has that conflict, and then, oh, here's a good moral, and everything all works out in the end. Kind of isolated kid show feel for episode 6. So I don't think it has that strong of a plot compared to other episodes. Episodes 7 and 8 I think are really good. They have Aang, they bring in the concept of Aang and the spirit world and Avatar Roku, kind of that spiritual side of him being the Avatar. Gives you a little bit about the mechanics of the spirit world, and Avatar Roku being one of Aang's past lives. They really give you a lot of information, and yet that episode does stay pretty interesting. The comet, the aspect of the comet coming, and how Aang has to defeat the Avatar by the end of summer really raises the stakes of the story. It gives us a deadline for Aang's actions. It sets up Ozai as the Fire Lord, and how, okay, it was this kind of oppressive ruler entity, and now he has the potential for so much destruction and world domination. It really just takes that villain, and not just the individual villain, but kind of the oppressiveness of the Fire Nation, and it really ups the ante even further. And I think that's done really well without it feeling like, oh my gosh, this entire show is just impossible, or wow, this show got really dark really fast. I don't think, one kind of plot hole with those 2 episodes, Avatar Roku destroys the temple at the end of it, and it makes no sense. Like, why is the whole temple this collateral damage at the end of this thing? Like, oh, maybe it was because the fire sages were so corrupt. You had to just bring them. No, that doesn't make any sense. It just seems a little extra, and it's not really explained. Like, why would the fire sages temple is supposed to be this really, like, sacred place in the same way that, like, other significant Avatar areas are significant in the 4 nations. And I just thought that was a little odd, kind of looking into it in more critically. Episodes 9 and 10 overall, I think, just really work to just continue that world building and, bring out your character development. With the waterbending scroll, again, it feels a little bit like a kid's story. You have this kind of jealousy between Katara and Aang, and the only big contribution to the plot is that Zuko is following and tracking, he's following the Avatar and that kind of encounter they have there. Episode 10 is really interesting. I know it's kind of, I guess I would say it's probably like a fan favorite episode if I would have to classify it as one. I think a lot of Avatar The Last Airbender fans have their own favorite episodes, but I feel like the episode with Jet is pretty consistently a fan favorite. He's a really interesting character.
He's a very memorable character. Like, even if it's not one of your favorite episodes, I think it's an episode that's very memorable.
Yeah. And I think as far as the plot goes, I'm going to touch on Jet a little bit later, but I think the plot is really interesting for that episode because here you kind of see the wrong side of this resistance. It's this morally gray area. Does the end justify the mean, versus do we still do the right thing because it's the right thing? Jet wanting to attack the Fire Nation, vulnerable civilians, are they casualties of war or are they innocent civilians? Those are really complex processes to think through for a kid's show, and it kind of brings in the concept of war and how civilians are, in a way, should they or shouldn't they be part or involved in a war if they're just innocent civilians. So I think it's really interesting. I also think that the kind of the humor in that episode of Sokka's instincts and how he ends up being right in the end, his instincts really do serve him well. So it overall, kind of overarching, some notes I have, just episode 6 really kind of highlights the Fire Nation oppression with the oppression of the Earth Kingdom citizens. It probably feels the most of these 5 episodes like a Saturday morning cartoon. Episode 7 and 8, Aang needs help learning how to be the Avatar. That's kind of a good theme of those 2 episodes, I think, that are really interesting. And it also sets up that comet deadline. And then 9 and 10 really is just mostly continuing world building and character development. So I don't have a lot of negative things to say, but I only give it 1 out of 2 points because I think overall these episodes just feel like very Saturday morning cartoon-esque. So they kind of have each, specifically episode 6 and 9 and 10 have like a beginning, a middle, and an end. And I guess 7 and 8 are kind of like a 2-parter episode. They have very much a beginning, a middle, and end. They do bleed into each other and they fill out the rest of the series as a whole. But we're introduced to this character of Haru, and then that's done. We've moved on. We're introduced to the Fire Sages. We know about the comet for later on. That's, pretty overarching story. But those characters, that location, we feel at the end of it, we're never going to see them again. And then the same with the rest of those episodes, 9 and 10. Specifically, we're invited into this world, and then it really feels like an open and closed book versus a chapter of the rest of the show. And I don't think that's a negative thing, but I think that it's not as well-rounded and fleshed out, especially in comparing to some of the other episodes of this show as a whole. So I'm trying not to compare too much to future episodes, but once you've seen a whole show beginning to end, it's really difficult to separate an analysis of this is what the show is like all the time versus I know what the show is going to be. So I kind of have to give that disclaimer that this is coming from someone who has seen the show in its entirety multiple times. So I'm not trying to be overly harsh, but I'm kind of comparing the show to itself because I think it gets better.
Yeah, I think in a way, having that perspective of people who are familiar with the show, if this is your first time watching the show or your first time hearing anything about Avatar, you might be listening to Holland talking and being like, wow, this doesn't sound like a great show. But the fact of the matter is that these are not the best episodes in a very fantastic show. And so like you should get through them because it does get so much better and like more fleshed out.
And all of these episodes do continue to build the world, set up the plot, introduce these characters, build these characters, flesh out these characters. So I wouldn't say that anybody that wants to watch this show should skip these episodes either. So that being said, I think they're good episodes. They're just not as high caliber as, even comparing to other TV shows, but in comparing them to some of the other episodes that exist in this show. So 1 out of 2 points for me.
Okay, so for me, out of 2 points for plot, story, and cohesion, I also gave it 1 out of 2 points. I feel like I'm a lot of what you said, I mirror those sentiments. I feel like for me, these chunk of 5 episodes feels a lot like we are laying sort of some boring groundwork that will sustain us through the rest of the show. But in the context of just the 5 episodes, it can make these episodes feel kind of boring. And not to say that they're boring all the way through, but there are significant times in these 5 episodes where my attention kind of drifts or my focus kind of wanes. And it's just because I'm like, I don't really like care to get these sort of like shallowy moments. And not to say that they are shallow, but comparatively, like you said, they can feel a little light, I guess, and not as meaty as other episodes. So this grouping of 5 is definitely not my favorite, but I do think there are some good things, so I want to talk about the good things. We start to get a big understanding that the Fire Nation has a wider reach of oppression than we originally see in the first 5 episodes. So this is now the second set of 5 episodes, and we're starting to really get an understanding of like the power that the Fire Nation has exerted on other nations in this world, and that the reach of the Fire Nation is affecting basically every known corner of the Avatar's world at this point. And it makes the weight of what Aang eventually has to do feel, it's a stake raiser. You're realizing that it's not just that, Avatar's got to come in here and, defeat the Fire Lord and everything's going to be cool. It's not only that, but the Fire Nation has been effectively oppressing nations, and that is just the cleanup in and of itself is going to take the rest of Aang's life. And so I think it kind of puts into perspective that it's not just a big battle. Like, this whole show is not just about one big battle and everything's good again. There is a work that is going to have to be put into this. And the Avatar's work extends past just really cool, bending fights. Like, that's not the extent of his job. And so I think setting that up and kind of helping us get that understanding is very important, especially through the rest of the series. There's a lot of good world building with this spirit world finally being kind of explored. We have 2 episodes in these 5 that focus very heavily on the spirit world and what that means and how Aang can travel in and out of the spirit world, how his abilities are affected in the spirit world, communication, what the different spirits are, and like, are they all good or are they all bad? We get a view into that sort of side of the lore, I guess, of the world of Avatar. And, we kind of see that there's a scary side to it. I mean, you have this monster destroying this town, and Aang is like accidentally transported and trapped within the spirit world, and he has to figure out how to defeat this crazy spirit monster with no bending abilities. So we get to just see kind of that, Aang does have limitations in the spirit world, and just understanding how that works a little bit, I think, is kind of significant. Again, it all feels like setup to me. It's like, these 5 episodes is like, I'm just going to give you more understanding of how the world works, how the world operates. And there's not a lot outside of that. I think Katara losing her necklace is a pretty significant plot point, maybe the most significant plot point in these episodes. And then, of course, I feel like you get a little bit of I don't know if it's a trope. I don't know what else to call it, but we have this moment where Aang realizes that because he has been gone for 100 years, he has the conversation with Roku, which basically tells him, that's why I don't know why I called it a flashback. It's not a flashback, but he has a conversation with Avatar Roku. And Roku's basically says, you have mere weeks to cram in years of work, so you better get busy. And it kind of makes the momentum of the show shift a little bit at that moment, but not enough in a way that makes me feel like, all right, it's time to like buckle up and hang on for the ride. So it's not quite as satisfying. I think that conversation could have felt a lot more weighty if there was more action right behind it. But I also understand why they couldn't do that, because you don't want to suddenly unrealistically start moving our characters in a speed or a way, or skip anything, because I feel their journey is kind of important, this journey to the other water temple or the other water tribe. So overall, I feel like, because these episodes just sort of feel like world building and understanding the world, it just doesn't, there's not as much interest as other episodes hold. So because of that, I just gave it 1 out of 2 points.
Alrighty. Alright, so our next category is characters. So I gave this category, out of the total possible score of 3 points, I actually gave it 3 out of 3 points. I did not really evaluate a lot of the side characters in this, because I think that these 5 episodes, even though the plot isn't super engaging, I think the characters in these episodes are very engaging, and it really focuses on our main cast very, very well. So I didn't really delve into a lot of the side characters in reviewing this, because I think that these 5 episodes just continue to flesh out our main cast very well. Haru and his dad in episode 6 are really not that interesting. I mean, they're kind of helping to move the plot more than they are like depth of characters, but I think as characters overall, those earthbenders in that episode help, like you said, it kind of fleshes out that oppression of the Fire Nation. So a lot of these side characters really are less character devices and they're more plot devices. So I don't want to touch too much on them because I really think the characters of the main cast just continue to be very, very good in these 5 episodes. I think Katara, we're seeing her grow. She's has moments where she's pretty gutsy and determined, especially in episode 6, even though the plot may not be super interesting. Her as a character, we're seeing a lot of her as a character. I mean, she's willing to go into a Fire Nation prison. Like, who knows what that's going to be like? And yet then we still see these very human aspects of her. Like, she's jealous of Aang's natural waterbending ability, which is a very real reaction that I think a grown adult would have, let alone a 14, 15, 16-year-old adolescent would have that kind of reaction. So, and I think they approached it very well, that in developing that aspect of her character, that she's not this whiny little temper tantrum throwing, undermining her own character. She's just having some genuine frustration that she's been trying to waterbend, and it's her, in a way, it's her heritage and her culture, and now Aang is just leaping and bounding ahead of her in learning this craft. And I think that they did a good job. I think it's notable in her character that she acknowledges her fault and kind of ties it up with a bow nicely at the end of the episode, but that her and Aang's relationship still remains, pretty strong. They don't have like this huge falling out in that episode. I think we see the most development in this chunk of episodes in Sokka. We really get to see him utilized a lot more. He comes more to the forefront of our main cast. He's protective of his group. He won't let Katara stay alone. He's like, this is your deadline. You're not staying in this prison longer than X amount of time. And then we get to finally see this strategic ability of his in the episode where they're trying to get into the Fire Sage's temple. It's his idea to light, a fuse and set off an explosion and simulate 5 firebenders with, basically gunpowder. And I think that we get to finally see his creativity and ingenuity. We see it in that episode, and then we see it again in Jet when he's, just something as simple as like amplifying the vibration so that he can hear somebody coming, or, making these kinds of evaluations and assessments. We just show him as this very strategic individual and see him as a contributing member to the team versus him just being this non-bender following along comic relief kind of character. And kind of like I said earlier, his instincts, when they're laughing about Sokka's instincts, making this running gag about Sokka's instincts end up being right and saving a lot of people in the end. I also think that we see Aang really grow into this, what does it mean to be the Avatar? It's more than just learning all the bending elements. It's this spiritual aspect of things and being the link between the spirit world and things like that, and his interactions with Heibai and things of that nature. So, which is a big change. And I think that we're watching Aang kind of mature into this role very, very gradually, or maybe he hasn't matured into this role, but we're watching him realize that this role does take a lot of his attention. I mean, he needs to be ready and equipped for that. And of course, the pressure of having to learn everything he needs to learn before the end of summer. We also see in these episodes, I think we see a lot of development in Zuko and Iroh as well, which I always think is very interesting when we have a show that's a kid's show and we're seeing development in our villains. So many shows, just your villain is this figurehead or this goofy, slappy, bumbling villain, cartoonish villain that even though they're funny and entertaining, have zero character development whatsoever. And we're seeing Iroh and Zuko's relationship with each other. So Iroh supporting Zuko, and then Zuko tracking and following Iroh to try and find him. That the way we see that Iroh acts when he's captured by the Earth Kingdom soldiers, and his cleverness and his ingenuity. And then he knows that Zhao is following them, so he helps give them kind of a fake trail, things like that. And then we also see, not just Iroh and Zuko as our villains, but we see Zhao, and how Zhao is a formidable villain to our villains. We have an antagonist to our villains, which I think is a really interesting dynamic to have in a show like this as well. It's not just Zuko and Iroh that are our villains tracking the Avatar, but they have a villain too. They have an adversary. And so it's a pretty clever thing to give your audience a way to root for your villains, because you may not, that they're the enemy of the Avatar, but their enemy is even worse. So the enemy of my enemy is, it's
right. Is my friend.
Yeah. So you would think, oh, well then that means that you should like Zhao because he's Zuko and Iroh's enemy. Like, no, we don't like Zhao.
Because I think they set up the power dynamic very specifically in a way that it's like Zhao has almost no redeeming qualities about him.
Exactly. And he's clever, and he's powerful, and he's ruthless. We just see a lot of this kind of coming into play in these episodes where we're like, I don't like this guy. Maybe Zuko and Iroh aren't that bad. And in seeing their relationship with each other, especially how much Iroh cares for Zuko, and even how Zuko is like, he's tracking his uncle down and trying to find him, and, because he's been captured. Even in that, Zuko cares. It's not like he's glad to be rid of his annoying uncle. It's somebody that he does have an affection for. The kind of two side characters that I think are pretty interesting and is the Fire Sages. I think it's just as a whole are very interesting. How their allegiance is not, they're supposed to be serving Avatar Roku's temple, and yet their allegiance is not to the Avatar, which would be the most obvious. Their allegiance is to the Fire Nation. And I think that's a very interesting dynamic, how you've kind of, in a way, it's like they've politicized their group, so if we're thinking just conceptually, the Fire Sages are the Avatar, the most like spiritual aspects of the Fire Nation's incarnation of the Avatar, which was Avatar Roku. Well, then you would think when Aang shows up, they'd be like, you're the reincarnation of Avatar Roku. How can we help you? And yet, no, they're completely allegiant to the Fire Nation as a whole. They want Aang captured. They have no interest in supporting Aang at all. And I just think that's a very interesting concept, that they're the exact opposite of what you would expect them to be. And then I kind of already touched on Jet. I do think Jet's a very memorable character. He's kind of a fan favorite. I feel like he's also one of those characters that it's kind of like Tumblr fodder, So, because he's the bad boy who walks around with a piece of hay sticking out of his mouth. Like, I mean, it's
and
just...
they very obviously set up that, like, Katara immediately has a crush on this guy.
Right, right. And I think that's fine. It's like, what you're going to have that happen in kids' TV shows and adults' TV shows. You're going to have this kind of like will they, won't they dynamic. But I think that it's really, I like that at the end of it, Jet does not change. He does not go back on his ways. He's a man of conviction. I mean, he's a kid, but he's a man of conviction, and he sticks to it till the end. And his perspective is his perspective, and he believes it to the end. And I really, really appreciate that he sticks to his convictions, and he's not like by the end of the episode, he's like, oh, you know what? I was wrong. I see everything your way now. Let me join your Avatar journey team and just come along with you. He believes what he believes. He's, the means justify, or the end justifies the means. And, we need to end the Fire Nation's reign at all costs. And if there's casualties of war, there's casualties of war. And we're going to do what we can to protect innocent people. that are not Fire Nation. And if there are people that are Fire Nation that get hurt, then that's just too bad. We've still stopped the Fire Nation at all costs. And so it's not necessarily the kind of role model, if your kid is watching this show, it's not exactly the role model that you would want for your kid. But I do think that in the way that Katara and Aang and Sokka all interact with him still brings out that kind of morality through it, and they address it in a very realistic way. So character-wise, I think it's great that you have this very contrasting, this person that's technically we're on the same side, but we're really not, because the way we want the same conclusion, the way we want to go about getting the same conclusion is very, very different. And so I think that that's really interesting for a kid's show. It's really, there's a lot of depth to that, and having those hard conversations, I think, it's kind of a conversation piece when you think about it with your kids. If you're watching this with your kids, that like, yeah, we're going to have people that we both want the same end goal, but the way we go about it is different. Mm-hmm. And our morals and our worldview and our convictions make us different people, even though we may want the same goal at the end. So that's a little bit of a tangent, but I do think it's a good character development for the show, and I think it's really interesting. And I think it's one thing that makes that episode pretty popular, makes Jet as a character very interesting and very popular, because he's so different from the Avatar team, and yet he is kind of on the same side as our little team Avatar, but the way he wants to go about things is just so wrong. So all of that to say, I didn't want to go into too much, because we do talk about these characters in our previous episode, and when we do another episode about the rest of the show, we're going to cover in more about characters. So I didn't want to go and rehash things we've already said. So just as a continuation, I would say the characters are pretty consistent with the prior episodes and are consistent when compared to the rest of the show. So 3 out of 3 for me.
Okay, cool. Okay, so for me, for characters out of 3 points, I gave it 2.5 points out of 3. I think that we do see a lot of new side characters kind of get introduced in this chunk of episodes. And I think it could be a good and a bad thing. The bad thing being that sometimes it does feel like a lot, like we're just getting inundated with all of these characters, and they don't stick around for more than an episode or two. But at the same time, a lot of these characters are very interesting and kind of bring that specific episode to life, or that specific locale, or wherever the crew happens to be at the moment. We get characters like Jet and his crew. We get Haru. We get the sages, kind of, you mentioned them. And I think they're all very interesting and good characters that serve the purpose that they have in those episodes. So I think those are good things about it. I just kind of wish that they didn't so much feel like one and done characters, and that we had more of an opportunity to sort of see how their lives are affected, or how they affect our heroes' lives. In these episodes, we do see Aang kind of getting a larger picture of the state of the world, and that means that we start to see these moments where Aang grapples with a lot of sadness or guilt. I think it's a interesting thing to do, but also makes a lot of sense. Granted, I mean, I don't know how I would handle the fact of being in an iceberg for 100 years and then coming back and realizing that the world is in a sucky state, and I potentially could have had the power to do something about that and had no, ability to do that. So I can only imagine that sadness and guilt makes perfect sense. I think he handles it way better than I would. And I also appreciate the fact that we don't just see those emotions come forward in Aang once, but they're kind of recurring flaws, if you will, in him, which I don't really think that they are flaws, but I think it's just kind of something that really makes Aang feel realistic and human. And I like that these are things that he grapples with over and over, but yet doesn't let it pin him down for too long. I think he shows a lot of resolve against these things, even if they are reoccurring struggles. I think all of us could say that there are certain things in life that we struggle with over and over and over, but we still do our best to press through. And I think Aang is a great example of that as well. There is a very unexpected action from Katara in these episodes, and that's stealing. Katara steals the scroll. It doesn't feel like her at all. And I don't really know how I feel about it. I think it's good to see your heroes do some cruddy things every once in a while, especially if there is like true remorse and resolve of those cruddy things. Obviously, you don't want your heroes doing cruddy things and then getting away with it. But that's not the case here. She does fess up and make it right. But it feels like the first stark "who are you" moment, I think, in the show, because it just goes against everything she so loudly protests all the time. So,
well, I think they kind of get around that because she's stealing from pirates who pretty much admit that they stole it plundered it from waterbenders. So
very Robin Hood.
Yeah, so I think in a way it's a little different. I wouldn't say it's necessarily 100% justified, but they kind of give you a reason why someone like Katara, especially when she's like so desperate to get better at waterbending because Aang's catching up to her so fast, and they kind of give you some justifiable reasons, quote unquote, for why she would feel the freedom to steal it. And then I think they do a good job of having her have pretty significant consequences of that action. So they don't say that like stealing's okay if you're stealing from somebody that is a crappy person.
Right.
But if you do, because everything seems okay, you're probably still going to have consequences.
Yeah, that's a good point. I also agree with your point about there's a really good focus on Sokka in these episodes, especially episode 10, which is the episode with Jet. It really gives us good insight that Sokka, while he may not be a bender, he brings a lot of really good things to the team. One of those being that he really has a great sense of discernment. And it's unfortunate that Katara and Aang don't immediately give him that credit. And I think it's, for different reasons, obviously. Like, Aang just thinks Jet's cool because Jet compliments him and, makes Aang feel good. And then Katara has a crush on the boy. So it's unfortunate that, Sokka is at first painted in their eyes that he's just either jealous or grumpy because, Jet's cooler than him or whatever. But at the end, he really has to, make the resolve that, I have to follow my gut here, and it pays off in the end and keeps them safe, and the people in the village keeps them safe too. So I think that it's a great episode to kind of show us that Sokka really has some good leadership qualities that he exudes in that episode, and he's coming to kind of learn how to trust his gut and act on it without doing so in a pushy or bossy sort of way. He just comes to the realization that nobody else is going to do anything about this because nobody believes me, so I must take the initiative to do the right thing. And I think that's a very valuable asset that Sokka brings to the team. Not to say that Katara and Aang don't have integrity, but I think Sokka acts on that integrity even if it makes him look like the bad guy for a moment, because he just believes so strongly in whatever that right thing to do is. And I just think that's a really great character moment that we get from Sokka. As always, the voice acting is 10 out of 10. I can't talk enough about the skills of the voice actors for this. They're just so good, and really props to all of them, because I know that some of them were quite young when they recorded this, and yet they still bring so much life and depth and emotion to these characters, and really just, I think, I would maybe wager to say that their performance is really what gave the show the success that it had. Or one of the highest factors of the show's success is the voice acting. So in these episodes specifically, even though it's a lot of story building and kind of understanding the world, they really make even the moments that I find kind of flimsy, still realistic and fun to listen to. And they just, the performances are always 10 out of 10. So 2.5 points out of 3 for me.
Alrighty. So our next category is aesthetics. And I gave this, out of a total possible score of 2, I gave this 2 out of 2. I think that this show overall is so incredibly consistent visually. It just does such a good job that every episode that you watch still feels like it's part of the same world. It's extremely consistent. The animation style is just great. The use of the animation style and kind of the visuals of humor are pretty good. Like, for example, in episode 6, when they're supposed to all act natural and they're all it looks like a freeze frame, but they're literally all just standing there frozen looking natural. Like, that's pretty
like
humorous.
The Fire Nation guards are like,
yeah, and they're all just like standing there awkwardly, like not in any way looking natural. It's just a cute and clever visual.
The show is funny.
It is, and a lot of that visual humor is used really well, I think. The visuals of Heibai, those 2 forms that he has, as far as like the spirit world and the visuals for that, are just done really well. This is the first time we really get a good picture of what is the spirit world and what does it look like, and it looks otherworldly without looking so unfamiliar that now we feel like we're watching a completely different show. The fire temple and the prison, I love the design of that. The design of the fire temple and the design of the prison where Haru and his fellow earthbenders are all being held. It is very distinctly Fire Nation looking. So even in like whether it's a prison or whether it's a fire sage's temple, it looks very distinctly Fire Nation. The architecture, the design, the way the stonework looks, it all just looks very, very uniform and consistent with that specific nation. There's a lot of cinematic aspects, I feel like, in the show as a whole, where it feels like we're watching a movie and not a cartoon. For example, when Haru gets taken and Katara sees his mom crying, that's a very cinematic shot. It really pulls you into the emotion of that scene. And then things like our action scenes, there's various action scenes, but like when they're running the blockade in episode 8, there's different action and combat scenes. The waterbending in episode 9, Katara's waterbending and Jet's sword bending, Katara's waterbending versus Jet's sword fighting in episode 10. All of those action scenes just feel very fluid and organic. It doesn't feel like it's a big mess. We can't watch what's going on. We can't keep track of anything. It feels very choreographed, even though it's an animated show. It feels like somebody was very intentional about, if this was real world and these were 2 human beings fighting together, their bodies could and would move in this way. Their, weapons could move in this way. A boat actually moves in this way. It doesn't feel cartoony. It feels very organic and grounded in a real world, even though this world is fantastical and has all these, bending abilities and spirit worlds and all of that stuff. It still feels grounded in reality. I do really like some of the creature design. I think I may have touched on this in our last episode, but the creature designs in this show are just great. Heibai's 2 different forms I really like. I like the design of Fang, the dragon, Roku's dragon, very Eastern style dragon. Looks great. The way that his kind of whiskers move, and when he touches Aang's forehead with his whiskers, that is very different from a Western style dragon or British style dragon.
Good point.
The design of the rhinos that the Rough Rhino Riders, whatever those guys are called, that they ride, they look very powerful. They look more like militant animals that you would ride, and versus, it's kind of like someone coming in on a tank versus somebody coming in on the cavalry horseback. The ostrich horses, and then I think the pirate's lizard bird, the as a variant of a parrot, is just really clever. These creepy seedy looking pirates, to have a parrot that's like part lizard, part bird is just really innovative. I just really enjoy the different creature designs they have in the show. And then one other moment that I thought was really great, in episode 10, where Sokka's describing that he went to the town and those actions that he did, warning the townsfolk and stuff like that. They're almost like black and white stills of that story being told. And it's just a still shot, and, maybe it kind of moves a little bit, like that kind of Ken Burns effect, if you will. But then we're watching that story being told in like a black and white picture. And it just feels very cinematic. It feels unexpected compared to what you'd normally see in a kid's show, but it's very powerful storytelling. He's describing this very important, significant sequence of events that happened in the past to save these people's lives. And I felt like it's done very tastefully and given a visual representation that has impact to the story versus it just being like, oh yeah, this is what happened. I saved all these people's lives and warned them. It's like, no, it was this very, it brings you emotionally into the scene. And so moments like that, I think they do a really good job of kind of bringing you into the scene emotionally, visually, versus it just being a straight up, like, I'm not knocking it, but like a straight up, like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles or any other Saturday morning cartoon that just feels very cartoonish. And I think there's aspects for that. So, like Teen Titans Go or something like that is extremely cartoonish looking, but
it was meant to be that way.
It was meant to be that way. And this, I feel like, is meant to be taken a little more seriously, not just in story and character development, but in visuals and art and representation of those art mediums.
And cultures, I would say.
Yeah. So I think it just continues to aesthetically be done very well. Again, I don't want to rehash things we've kind of talked about before. The use of CGI in this show, I do think is still in these episodes pretty well integrated. I believe in the first 5 episodes, the CGI with the door lock that Aang has to use to get into the room with the statues that has Avatar Roku in there, that is CGI. And then they do the same thing here where the fire sages lock, all of those working kind of serpent looking pieces as they move, the locks open, those are CGI looking. And I think that it still works well. I think it was interesting that they chose for this quote unquote locking mechanism to be the one aspect that looks visually very different, because it looks like CGI versus looking like traditional hand-drawn animation. I don't know why they made that choice. I feel like they could have done it with just the traditional animation style, but I thought it was interesting to kind of keep that consistent in your story, that the locking mechanisms of the quote unquote temple area of whatever nation you're in is all CGI. But I think it works well and it looks cool. I think the lock looks really cool, if that's, super nerdy to say, but yeah, so I don't have a ton to like really hash into, but I gave it 2 out of 2 for aesthetics.
I think it's really funny that you say, if that's not too nerdy to say. We have a podcast where we review nerdy things for hours at a time.
Yeah, I know, but, people don't really talk about locks and the way they look when they open.
We do. Nothing's too nerdy for Lion Mouse commentary.
There you go.
Okay, for me, for aesthetics, I gave it 1.5 points out of 2. I think that this show is very solid in its aesthetics, but in these 5 episodes specifically, I didn't give it full points for this very simple reason. Nothing really wowed me in these episodes. And I don't mean to say that I feel like my bar is exceptionally high, but there was never really a moment where I was like, that's it. That's the visual moment that I was waiting for. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. This is only 5 episodes in a show of many episodes. But let me talk about some of the things that I think are good, just not necessarily excellent. I, for some reason, am a sucker for lantern lighting in anything, like show, movie, and whatever, video game. And they use lantern lighting quite a bit in this show, especially when it comes to the Fire Nation. And I just love the way that they use the lighting, and the glow feels very real, and it almost feels warm on the screen. And I love what you talked about, how And I talked about this a little bit in our last Avatar episode as well, where I love that each nation in Avatar The Last Airbender has its own color palette, like you said, architecture, feel, clothing styles, things like that of the people, and yet it all feels like one cohesive world while still having the very distinct four nations. And that continues in this. They use the color palettes very well. It's diverse. Now, in these episodes, though, there's a lot of traveling that happens as well. And so you get these episodes where you're not specifically in a locale that belongs to a specific nation, perhaps. So you don't get a lot of those like context clues. And I think in those episodes, they do very interesting things where they kind of almost blend palettes. For instance, in let me say like the Jet episode, like there's not really a specific color palette. So they bring in I feel like some of the freedom fighters do wear a lot of reds and blacks, so it almost feels kind of Fire Nation-y, but not at the same time because the style is different. And I found that very interesting. It feels very cohesive without being too pointed at anything. And I think that's good for the most part. Obviously, I think the score is so good in this show. I feel like I could listen to Avatar The Last Airbender music the way that I listen to video game music, which is to say all the time. I think if I were to say like my top 3 music genres, video game music is up there. And, well, really scores of any kind, I just think are good. And this is a score that I think deserves more praise than it gets. It is a score that is not in your face. It's not super loud. And I like that sort of thing. When I'm watching something or whatever, I want the music to fit. I want the music to fit so well that I almost don't realize it's there. And yet it's still so good. I can listen to it on its own and just enjoy every moment of it. And I feel like this show in general just gives us a great score. I think it's interesting that we get very specific different color palettes for the spirit world. Lots of whites, grays, blues. The shadows almost turn... it's almost like reverse shadowing in the spirit world. I don't know how else to describe it. But obviously, like, you understand what shadows are. And we see really great shading and shadows in kind of what I'd say the real world is in the show. And then when we flip over to the spirit world, it's almost like what you would expect to be shadowed almost gets brighter. Like there's like a weird ethereal light effect where there would be shadows. But at the same time, it doesn't make it feel less dark. It's so hard to explain without actually seeing it. So if you've never watched Avatar, you're probably thinking I sound like a psycho. But it's so strange to me how they take the colors and it's almost like the colors get leached out in the spirit world. And it almost gives like a unnatural effect that's almost like I don't want to be touching this for too long, you know? So I just think that's really cool. It's a very different color palette than we get from anything else in the show. It's like the spirit world has its own situation. And I think that you kind of talked on this too, but I have to agree that like the combat seems to be better in these 5 episodes than they were in the previous 5. It's getting smoother. They're doing, I think, more adventurous sorts of things. We're seeing different weapons from different characters and kind of getting an idea that like this character, you know, is an expert at this weapon we've never seen before, or this tribe of people bends in a new way. You know, we kind of see that there are variations to combat while it still looks very natural and like you said, very choreographed and not in a fake way, but just very intentional, I think is the word you used, and I have to agree with that. So, but all of those to say, you know, I think those things are all very good, but there was never a moment in these 5 episodes where I was just like, wow, you know, I forgot how good this looked or whatever. It's all just good, like just kind of run of the mill good. So that's why I only gave it 1.5 points out of 2.
I just think that I mean, I know when you're comparing it to other Avatar episodes, it may feel like run of the mill compared to Avatar, but I feel like compared to other children's geared kids cartoons, it's very much a step above in
Oh,
quality.
I agree with you completely. And that's why it was hard for me to kind of rank this category specifically for these 5 episodes.
So are you more, I'm just asking, just out of curiosity, are you more comparing it to itself in that?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
So this is within the confines of Avatar.
So like these 5 episodes in contrast to itself.
The next 5 or whatever.
Right.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or what I know the show is capable of, or even what we saw in the first 5 episodes. I just feel like it's sort of in the way that like the plot kind of
For my category.
Yeah, like the plot is kind of
comparing it to
compared
itself.
to.
Yeah.
It's the same thing here for me with aesthetics. It's like it's good, but I'm gearing up for something else.
Yeah. Yeah. Alrighty, so next category is personal taste and preference. As always, we are only allowed 2 points for this, and I gave these 5 episodes 1 out of 2 points. Again, as I mentioned before, Avatar for me as a show, as a whole, all 3 seasons, is 2 out of 2. I absolutely adore this show. But these 5 episodes just aren't really that impactful to me. In general, I acknowledge that they have necessary plot points, but they're overall very episodic, and to me, they feel just very flat and cartoony compared to other episodes in this show. Again, it's difficult to kind of evaluate it this way because, like Tori and I have both mentioned, we're kind of comparing this show to itself.
And it's hard for us to not do that, but it's also hard for us to do that because we understand we're trying to deliver our rankings based on these 5 episode chunks at a time, but knowing the context being what I would consider like a veteran of the show, it's really difficult for us to separate each chunk from its whole.
Right. And I think in general, if I was a new watcher and I had made it through the first 5 episodes and these 5 episodes, it would be kind of hit or miss if I were to continue the show. And like I'm saying, full disclosure, this show is 2 out of 2 for me. I thoroughly enjoy it. And I've literally watched it over and over again from start to finish. But if I was a new viewer and these 5 episodes were all I was exposed to of Avatar: The Last Airbender, it could be hit or miss if I continued watching the show. I would just think, yeah, it's kind of a nice, cute little kid show, but meh. In general, I don't really rewatch episodes 6, 7, and 8. I really don't tend to watch it. I'll just skip right past it. A lot of times in general, and this is, don't want to spoil anything, because we are going to continue to review this show. If I'm going to just watch an episode of Avatar, pretty much the episodes that I like to watch come from seasons 2 and 3.
I agree. The last time I rewatched the show in its entirety, I actually watched the last 2 episodes of season 1 and just started there.
Yeah. So it's my personal taste and preference of these episodes are pretty consistent with my opinion of season 1 for personal taste and personal enjoyment. It's really hit or miss if I want to rewatch an episode. So if I were to rewatch this season 1, and coming up through these episodes, I would probably skip 3 of these 5 episodes. So, but I do enjoy episodes 9 and 10. I think they're fun. I think they're enjoyable. So I wouldn't take, all the points away from personal taste and preference. But, at this point in the game, if I had no other knowledge of Avatar, it'd be really hit or miss if I continue. It's nice. There's not anything offensive that I would, I can't stand it. I'll never watch it again. But in rewatches, I don't typically care for these episodes. 9 and 10 are the ones that I enjoy more, but that's why I gave it just 1 out of 2 for me.
Okay. I'm actually in the same boat. 1 out of 2 for personal taste and preference. I agree almost 100% with all of your points. I do like episode 6, but that's mostly for the characters, not so much the story that moves. So I really like Haru, and I like that his introduction is here. I wish he was in a slightly better episode because I think he's just a really interesting character with a lot of integrity. I like him a lot. It's just a shame that we kind of get just like a blip of him and we don't see him again in these 5 episodes. And so, I do like episode 6, but episodes 7 and 8 are kind of throwaways for me, unfortunately. I don't think they're bad. I don't want to say anything like they're a slog to get through, because that's not true. But they don't contribute enough to me as a rewatcher, because I already know the things that they establish in those episodes.
Right.
Since I'm familiar with the series, I'm like, I already know the
Exactly,
those sorts of things. So
exactly.
I don't need those history bits or whatever. So I just move on. Or like I said, kind of skip to the end of this first season anyway. I think my favorite in these 5 episodes is episode 9, which is the waterbending scroll. And that mostly has to do with, I think that it has a really, really interesting dynamic between Katara and Katara and Aang. We get that really, really interesting kind of jealousy dynamic. Katara does some unusual things for her. We get to throw Zuko into that again, that mix of the three, of him with our 3 heroes, and I think that dynamic is always really interesting. And like you said, at this point, we've kind of gotten an explanation, more explanation of like what Zuko's stakes are and how those are different than Zhao's stakes. So I think by the time that we see him sort of reunited with our heroes, it's like it feels a little different than the last time they had a run-in. So I think that just the action in episode 9, I think, is probably the most satisfying for me, as far as combat and then like dynamics of characters. So 1 out of 2 points for me for personal taste as well.
Alrighty. And last category is creativity. So out of a total possible score of 1, I actually gave this full points. And the biggest reason I gave this full points is, it's difficult, I think, to assess creativity when we're having to break it up in episodes the way we are, because Avatar as a whole, I would give it 1 out of 1 creativity. But this chunk of episodes, maybe I would, maybe I wouldn't. But I think these episodes also justify that full point for creativity. I think the biggest reason is because of adding the spirit world element in addition to this fighting and bending aspect of this world makes it really interesting. The fact that Aang and Roku Roku is Aang's past lives, and I think these episodes continue to creatively expand the world while integrating humor and good character development. The side characters help make the world feel more human and real instead of it just being like, all the Fire Nation is bad and all the Earth Kingdom is good. In episode 9, we see that there are Fire Nation individuals who are not necessarily all bad. And in episode 6, we see there are Earth Kingdom people that are not necessarily all good. I'm sorry, episode 10, we see Fire Nation individuals that are not all bad, and we see Earth Kingdom individuals who are not all good. So we kind of see that it's not this black and white, all Fire Nation people are evil, all Earth Kingdom, non-Fire Nation, all of the non-Fire Nation people are good. We get to see this kind of blend that people are still just human. And I think that is an aspect that's not well explored in children's
media.
Especially children's cartoons.
True.
Like children's Saturday morning cartoons really don't delve that deep because you don't have that kind of time. They're one-off episodes that have a full resolution and don't really connect to anything else.
Yeah, I think kind of the idea of using like a children's show to sort of explore the idea that like good versus evil really comes down to personal responsibility and choice is like an interesting thing to kind of delve into.
Yeah. And it's really intricate, that Jet wants the same thing that Aang does, but the way he wants it is not the same.
Right.
So things like that I think are just very well explored, and because these episodes continue to expand and expound on new depths of Avatar as a show in ways that are not commonly seen in children's media, especially cartoons, 30-minute cartoon segments, I gave it full points for creativity. 1 out of 1.
Okay. And once again, I agree. 1 out of 1 point for creativity. I feel like even though we had some critiques about this chunk of episodes, I really think that we do start to finally fall into like a very good rhythm and styling for the show. It's a lot of establishing, that's true, but I think in that regard, a lot of that establishment is creative. The creative establishment is now very well understood, I think, from a viewer's perspective. I understand the art style. I understand, when I see these motifs or colors, or when I hear these sorts of motifs in the score, they start to have meaning and weight behind them, which I think is very creative. I think that, we're now in the part where we can start to play with these, for lack of a better term, character of the week characters that come in and out. Now we can play with those personalities a bit and kind of have fun with them and show a very diverse sort of cast. And I think those are creative aspects that shouldn't be ignored. Even if overall this chunk of episodes, doesn't necessarily resonate the same way with me and you as veterans of the show, it doesn't mean that they are any less creative than the show as a whole. And I think that should be distinguished, I guess, for lack of a better term, because I do feel like I have been critiquing the show quite a bit in these 5 episodes. So for me, yes, also 1 out of 1 point for creativity.
Alrighty, so what's your total score?
My total score is 7 out of 10 for these episodes.
All right, my total score is 8 out of 10.
Okay, fair.
Yep. Alrighty, I think the only area where we differed was I gave an extra half point compared to you for characters, and I gave an extra half point for aesthetics.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
But
so sorry, go ahead.
But I think the difference in those two is I think that we are pretty much in agreement. But I think I'm trying to compare this to typical kids cartoons, which is why I was a little more generous with those points.
That's fair.
But I think we're pretty much in agreement with these episodes. But
so are you ready for lightning round, or did you have any more thoughts?
No, I'm ready.
Okay, so some of our lightning round questions may sound a little redundant from the last time, but they just worked well, so we'll use some of them again. Okay, so favorite character or new character, you can choose, is one of our main characters becoming a favorite now in these episodes, or did you have a favorite new character?
I think, Zuko is Zuko and Iroh, I just think are great, and watching their development is really great. But I really enjoy in episode 9 the pirates as characters. Okay. I just think they're really interesting. I think they did a great job of making them like legitimately bad people versus like we're pirates but we're fun, like like slappy kind of goofy, happy-go-lucky cartoon pirates. They're like, no, we really like stole this from a waterbender. And so I like the pirates as characters.
I like pirates in general, and I like, don't get me wrong, I like good guy pirates, but it's nice when you finally get like, sometimes you get like the actual bad pirates and you're like, dude, okay, they're not good guys.
Yeah.
So yeah. For me, I kind of alluded to this already, but Haru, I just think I feel like some people sometimes argue that Haru is kind of boring, and I will admit that in the episode that he is introduced in, he is slightly flat, but I think that he serves his purpose really well. And I think, he may not necessarily be that interesting, but he does have a very like he has an integrity that like pushes him toward all of his actions. And I think that that's just like a really nice thing to see from a character that isn't necessarily our core heroes. It's just kind of like this, like just wants the right thing done character. And that's Haru. So I really like him. So next question, least favorite character in these episodes that we have reviewed.
I mean, you're going to probably not like this, but I feel like Haru and his whole group of people, I don't like them. I think
I'm not offended.
Boring. I just think they're so boring. I mean, I probably dislike the Fire Sages even more, but they're so minor. So I don't know. I think I'd have to say that Haru. He's just snore.
Okay. I'm not upset about it.
And it's like, I mean, I don't know. I think another thing that I don't like about Haru is like, here's a man being crushed to death and you're an earthbender and you're like, I can't.
Well, I mean, your whole village is under oppression. So, I would kind of be hesitant too.
I get that. I totally get that. And he does do the right thing. But the fact that he has that hesitation is kind of like, I don't know. I mean,
maybe I'm just a weenie, but I feel like I would also
I can see it both ways. I really can see it both ways. But I don't know. Maybe I'm just like, maybe this is just a reflection on me that I think too highly of myself, because I would think if I was in that situation, I'll save this guy's life. There's no way I'm going to get in trouble for earthbending when this water tribe girl saw me earthbend. And I'm about to save this dude's life. Like, it's not going to go bad if I save this guy's life. But then, plot twist, it goes bad when he saves the guy's life. So, no harm, no foul. I'm not knocking it.
Yeah.
But I'm just like, dude, you're an earthbender. And then it's like, they're on the bar. I just don't like that episode in general. It's like,
okay.
You're on the barge and you're like, oh, this is our fate now. Like, dude!
Eating the soup or whatever.
Yeah. And so it's like, come on. But I mean, the fact that like when Katara brings the coal, they're like, this is our fate now. It's like, come on. I thought you guys were supposed to be like, impressive. So that to me, it just makes him not very likable because he's not very interesting.
I got you.
But that's just my take.
That's okay.
If you're a Haru fan.
I'm a Haru fan, but I'm not offended.
Yeah, well, if you're listening, you're a Haru fan and you're offended.
Sorry,
but be like Tori and don't be offended.
So my least favorite character in the episodes that we're reviewing is Zhao. He sucks.
Yeah.
And I hate him.
Yeah.
He's a very, very good villain to our villains, kind of like
villain.
you said. But yeah, I kind of want to punch him in the face all the time. And I think that's good. Like,
yeah.
we want a character like that, but that doesn't mean I have to like him.
Right.
I don't like him at all. Even though he's integral to the plot, and I think he should be placed in the plot as he is, I still hate him. So that's why he's my least favorite.
That's totally fair.
Okay, next question. Which previous avatar do you think is the coolest?
So right now we have Roku and Kyoshi in this show.
Roku or Kyoshi? Who do you think's cooler?
Well, at this point, we don't know a lot about Kyoshi. I mean, we don't know a lot of their backstories, and without spoiling anything, we will at some point. So based on just what we know right now, I mean, I would probably say Roku because he gets to have a dragon as his like animal spirit guide.
Okay.
So I would just want Fang, his dragon.
Okay. I would say Kyoshi because the Kyoshi warriors that we met in the previous 5 episodes are really interesting. Plus, she didn't destroy a temple for no reason.
That's true. Avatar Roku did destroy a temple for no reason. So, facts.
We kind of already answered this next question, but favorite episode in this chunk?
It's a toss-up between 9 and 10. It kind of depends on what kind of mood I'm in. I've seen episode 10 so many times. So sometimes I'm kind of bored with it.
I remember episode 10 was one of those episodes that they like
aired on
did
TV
reruns
all the time.
All the time. So it must have been a fan favorite.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was just, I felt like I saw it all the time. So today it'd probably be episode 9 just because I'm a little tired of episode 10. It's just a little overplayed.
Yeah.
So, but I like both of them very much.
Same for me, and I talked about that already. So, what do you have like a moment that you think is the best in these episodes?
That I think is the best?
Like the best moment.
Well, a moment that one thing that I did not touch on in my review, I think the dialogue in this show is so good. Like we quote stuff, my family and I quote stuff from this show all the time. And I just think the most memorable like quotes from the show, from these episodes in particular, is when the whole bit about Sokka's instincts, I think are great. That whole bit back and forth is just so funny. And then the part where Katara is fake earthbending and she and Sokka are arguing with each other and getting in a fight to like, I'll show you earthbending style. That whole part.
Yeah.
It's so funny to me.
Said earthbending
Yeah,
style.
and like Aang's not paying attention, and do large animals use your ears for shade? Like, I mean, it's just like so goofy. I wouldn't say that's necessarily like the best moment, but I think one of the best moments, like visually, is like I kind of mentioned in aesthetics, that those black and white stills of Sokka warning the town. I just think that's absolutely beautiful. But those two kind of quotable moments are ones that I have just stuck with me for a long time. So
For me, I think the best moment in these episodes is in episode 10, when Katara and Aang finally realize like what Jet and the Freedom Fighters like plan is, and they realize Sokka is right, and they kind of have that moment where they're like, crud, like we should have listened. And Katara basically like ices Jet up against the tree, and then they realize that like they have no time left and everything falls on Sokka's shoulders. It's just like a really significant moment, I think, for the three of them specifically, is that it almost feels like up until then, Katara and Aang have almost had this expectation that Sokka should put his trust in them. And we get this moment where now they are forced to put their trust in Sokka. And it's just really satisfying as a viewer that he comes through and saves that village. So I think that's just like, for me, I think that's the best moment in these episodes.
yeah, I think you're right. I would agree.
So, okay, last question. If you had to get rid of any episode in this chunk, which one would you get rid of?
That's a tough one. If I had to get rid of one, that's a tough one, because like personal taste wise, I would probably say episode 6 because it's boring to me, but I think it's necessary to the plot, and so are 7 and 8. And 10, I think, are really important. So I would be tempted to say, well, I guess you'd have to toss episode 9 or 6. But, so that's what I would narrow it down to. But, I don't know. I also don't really like I don't know. I feel like maybe you could have condensed episode 7 and 8 into one episode. So that, if I could do that as my option, maybe I would just say that.
Okay. For me, I would throw away episode 7. I think the two big things that happen in episode 7 are we get a glimpse at kind of how the spirit world works and the restrictions. And I feel like they could have easily like put that into another episode, kind of like you said. Other than, I feel like the whole Aang battling the spirit monster thing is something that like we could kind of do without. And then the other thing that happens in that episode is that's the episode that Iroh gets captured. And Zuko has to track him down. Again, I feel like it's not as significant plot-wise as everything else. And it's things that could be included facets of in other episodes. So for that reason, I feel like it's the most skippable of all 5 of these episodes. So I would say I would get rid of that one.
I like the B plot, though, of Iroh and Zuko in that episode, though. I think it really highlights Iroh as a character and shows him as this kind of formidable firebender and that he can hold his own. But I agree. I do think that B plot really could have been in any episode.
Right.
We could have had that as the B plot for episode 6.
Because it's not affecting what our main heroes are doing at all. So they could have put that anywhere.
There is one moment, though, that I think is really interesting in that episode, is when Iroh sees Aang on the dragon. And so it's like this question, like, can Iroh see into the spirit world? Did he see that? Did he just happen to turn at the right time? So I think that part's really interesting, but it's not addressed or resolved in that episode. So I think that we could have, moved that B plot to some other episode.
Yeah. Any other thoughts?
No.
All right. Well, then thank you for joining us for this episode. We look forward to having you back. You can follow us on our social medias if you're not already. We have Twitter at Lion and Mouse Pod and Instagram at Lion and Mouse Podcast. Our website's lionandmousepodcast.com. Our rules of engagement are always there, notes from each episode. I'm very good at scanning those in so you can read our handwritten notes. We have a suggestion box. Tell us what you want us to review. If there's something that's really important to you or you think is absolutely awful and you would just want us to hear... and you just want to hear us talk about it for an hour to an hour and a half, we got you. Tell us what it is. You can also support us on Patreon. You can receive gifts, exclusive content for that support. And of course, if you like what you heard or didn't, just give us a review on your podcast platform of choice. Also, spread the word. I think word of mouth would be really important to help grow our podcast, and we would really appreciate that. So tell your friends, retweet our tweets, share our Instagram stories, whatever method works best for you. tell people about it. If you have a friend whose favorite show is Avatar: The Last Airbender and you're listening to this episode, make sure you share that episode with your friend, because they obviously want to hear us talk about it too, right? As always, just thank you so much for listening, and we will catch you in the next one.